all for standing by, and welcome to the Aquatic Invasive Species series, Science Behind Invasive Species webinar, hosted by the Great Lakes Sea Grant Network's Organisms in Transit Project. I am Jill Gentis-Benicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Greg Heitzroth and Dr. Ruben Keller. Thank you both for joining us today. Before we get started, I would like to take a few moments for the webinar viewers to get you familiar with the technology. During our presentations, all of you will be in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentations, please feel free to use the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen. Use the drop-down list to all panelists, and I will collect and pose your questions out after each presentation. If time allows, towards the end of the hour, we will continue to ask more questions. Also, if you have any technical questions at any time, please feel free to ask using the chat feature. We have nearly 100 participants on this webinar, a great diverse group representing individuals and programs from the Great Lakes and around the country. Please keep those questions coming throughout the presentations, and we should have great Q&A sessions. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the presentations. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill that survey out. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Greg Heitzroth from Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. Greg has been leading the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant's OIT, or Organisms in Transit, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative project for the past year, which focuses on outreach programming for aquarium hobbyists and water gardeners. Prior to this appointment, he was with the Chicago Botanic Gardens for 3 years working with citizen scientists. We are delighted to have Greg here today to begin the webinar by providing an overview of the aquatic invasive plants. Now, Greg, I'm going to unmute you, and I am going to hand over the presentation ball to you. You should be unmuted, and you should also have the presenter ball.
Okay, great. I just wanted to do a quick overview in the context of these webinars. So the topics in today's webinar will cover what it means to be an aquatic invasive plant, how potential invasiveness is measured through a risk assessment, and methods for preventing the spread of organisms from water gardens to public waters. The topics for the next webinar coming up on the 20th, so that's this Thursday, will cover principles of water garden design using native species and examples of commonly used invasive plants in water gardens and some alternatives. So these webinars, just to give you some context, in April this year, we did a workshop about preventing the introduction and spread of aquatic invasive plants into public waters through water gardens, and this was held at the Chicago Botanic Garden. And the purpose of this webinar series is to broadcast information presented at the Chicago Botanic Garden workshop to a Great Lakes-wide audience. And this series was funded through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And with that, I will start into my first presentation of the day, so an overview of aquatic invasive plants. Aquatic plants, much like terrestrial plants, have certain requirements, so nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, light, water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and space to grow, so just some physical space. And really, this graph on the right-hand side of the screen, let me see if I can get this pointer tool to work. Yeah, so this graph right here pretty much is saying that photosynthesis is occurring, so carbon dioxide is going in, oxygen is coming out when there is a light source. So this is a light source. I think this is supposed to be an aquarium diagram, but we could think of this as being the sun for all intents and purposes. When there is no light source, typically what's happening is carbon dioxide is moving out, and the plants are using oxygen. And so this is going to make sense in a few more slides, but for now, just hold on with me as I go through some slides and talk about aquatic plants a little bit more. So for water gardeners, aquatic plants usually mean shallow water plants, so like what we see as marginal plants, so plants that grow in moist soil to shallow water, leaves and flowers mostly above the water surface, and so they're rooted in the soil, and typically things like cattails, like I think this diagram is kind of showing, are a good example of that. Free-floating plants, so these little guys here on the surface, submerged roots and are unrooted to the sediment, and so they're free-floating. So free-floating plants is a very apt name. And typically some examples of this are water hyacinth and water lettuce. Rooted floating plants, leaves and flowers typically above the water. There's also submerged leaves, and it's rooted into the sediment. So these are examples of water lilies and lotuses. Okay, and then submerged plants or oxygenators, they're also called, are typically generally underwater. They have above water reproductive abilities, but often all the vegetative pieces are below the water. And so that's just a quick overview of aquatic plants. So we're really talking about invasive species, so aquatic invasive plants in this case. And so a quick definition, the one that I like is that invasive species are essentially species that are occurring outside their natural geographic range, introduced through human release, either intentional or unintentional, and potentially cause ecological or economic harm. And I'll go through each one of these a little bit more. So what do I mean by natural geographic range? So essentially most species have a natural distribution across the country or wherever, and then there are barriers to that distribution. Some barriers can be large examples like oceans, mountains, deserts, or Niagara Falls as an example, but they can also be a little more subtle as temperature and salinity, so like salt water. So I like to imagine the ocean being as a good example of a barrier to freshwater ecosystems from Europe to the United States. So a species being transported from Europe to the United States has a very large salty barrier of the ocean to transport across. And so really we're now thinking about how that species is being transported across those barriers. And so there's some passive introductions. And so really a lot of this presentation is going to focus on water gardens, but there's also aquariums, shipping industry, boating, and fish stocking, such as game fish and aquaculture involved in introduction of organisms. And the success of invasion is sometimes based on unchecked growth. So essentially, these species are being introduced into new locations where they don't really have the competition of their old habitat or natural geographic range. And so you're seeing a lack of herbivory and or disease not really controlling those populations as they would in their natural areas. And so really once these species are in these ecosystems, they can have negative consequences such as reduced species diversity. They can compete with native plants, and which is especially a big problem for threatened or endangered plant species. They can change animal community interactions as well as plant community interactions, degrade water quality, increase buildup, change sediment chemistry, and impede water flow and movement. And then there's also the economic impact, such as impaired recreation, so boating, fishing, swimming, et cetera. Changes in flooding regimes, decreased property values, such as having a pond in your backyard or a lake in your backyard full of weeds, and so no one wants to buy weedy property. Create habitat for mosquitoes, reduce waterfowl habitat, and then the ever-present removal costs, which can sometimes be quite extraordinarily large, such as an estimate of $100 million annually for each year in the 1990s for removal of aquatic invasive plants, and then $29 million in Florida between 2008 and 2009. So I just gave a lot of information really quickly, and I'm going to go through a lot of that information in the context of examples. And so I'm going to give you 3 examples of aquatic invasive plants. So purple loosestrife, water chestnut, and hydrilla. And so purple loosestrife is a marginal plant. Water chestnut is a rooted floating plant, and hydrilla is a submerged plant. So purple loosestrife was introduced from Europe. There's a few suspected cases of how it was introduced. it was definitely introduced as an ornamental in the 1800s. There's also some speculation whether or not it was introduced through livestock, like the seeds were hanging out in the fur of livestock, or even through the shipping industry of shipping seeds accidentally from Europe. This is a very robust plant, so I can see why it's being used as an ornamental. So there's been documentation of it growing up to 10 feet tall, having 50 stems, and the seed production, this is a very large estimate. It's probably the largest one I've seen, but it's about 3 million seeds per year. I've seen estimates in like 10,000 seeds per year. And so generally speaking, it just produces a lot. It likes to grow in pastures with shallow water, so it grows across a wide variety of habitats. So it makes it pretty aggressive in multiple habitats and spreads through seeds mostly, but it can also reproduce vegetatively. And this distribution map up to the right, the darker colors are not necessarily indicative of higher quantity, but it's more like a fine scale mapping of the population location. So like New Mexico doesn't necessarily have a light blanket of purple stripe all over it. So this is just a general distribution of where the species are, or species is. And so that's the basic background of the species, but ecological problems associated with it could be things such as a loss of high-quality bird habitat. Specifically, it competes with native cattails, reducing suitable nesting for those birds, reduce plant diversity so it doesn't compete with other plant species, and is pretty aggressively choking out other species. Can change sediment nutrient timing, so it decomposes very early compared to the native species, so it's decomposing and producing nutrient input in the fall versus what you'd see with most native species producing nutrients in the spring. And so these changes in nutrient timing sometimes affect things such as tadpole survival, changes wetland function, so sometimes it can overtake areas that are typically open water. And then there is the annual loss of approximately 200,000 acres of wetland each year, estimated. And so the economic costs have been estimated at about $48 million a year. And so this is a couple factors that are involved in this number, such as control cost, loss of forests, and then also waterfowl habitat loss. Okay. And then the next example I have is water chestnut. And this is of European, African, Asian ancestry. So it's an ornamental from 1877, introduced into, I believe it was Harvard by a botanist there. I think it was cultivated for food in East India and China, but it's not what we consider water chestnut, as in like American Chinese cuisine. That is actually Elaeocorus dulcis. And so it was introduced as an ornamental species for water gardeners. It likes shallow water, also very still water. It's been recorded to grow into 15 feet deep of water, but mostly like about 6 feet, so it is pretty shallow. It's an annual species and reproduces through a 4-pronged nutlet with barbs. So this is the barb. I will point this again in a few minutes. The distribution of the species is mostly in the Northeast, but there's a lot of effort to seems like is there okay, so people are having a hard time hearing me. Okay, well, so most of the distribution is on the Northeast coast. There's a little bit of concern about spreading into other areas, and so there's quite a few programs for watching the spread of the species. And so there's species identification cards, I believe, through Sea Grant. I believe it may have been Minnesota Sea Grant. I may be wrong on that. So Traponatans also creates a dense surface canopy. The light penetration can be reduced by about 95%, which is really pretty high. And so This can be related to a depletion in oxygen. So remember that photosynthesis example that I mentioned before. So when there's no light really penetrating these submerged species below water chestnut are typically taking on oxygen without producing it, and so there's a general depletion of oxygen below the water chestnut, and this can impact invertebrates and fish. But there's also a lot of biomass it produces, which has other effects. So it's about 17,000 pounds of dry biomass per acre. So that's once you remove all the water. That's kind of a lot of biomass. So it also adds to sediment loads, increases turbidity and eutrophication, so essentially makes the water less light penetratable. And then there's also lower forage value for waterfowl from the species than other native species, and so it's not as good of eating potentially for the species. So it makes bad food. So it also has the economic impacts of loss of recreational activities. So this barb potentially is very painful to step on. I've never done it myself. I don't really care to do it or find out if it is really all that painful, but apparently it's very, very sharp. But also it can reduce boating, swimming, and fishing as well. And so the cost of removal is quite high. Here are a couple of examples of that specifically. So over 20 years in Lake Champlain, it costs nearly $5 million to remove water chestnut. And then the Potomac River, this is a little older example, and this is for inflation, adjusted for inflation to the modern day equivalents of dollars for the removal of Potomac. So, and then the final example is Hydrilla versalata, also known as hydrilla, which was introduced from Asia. It's a submerged species or an oxygenator. It's typically considered an aquarium plant, and I believe that's what it was introduced for. But often I should say sometimes it's a contaminant with common water garden plants as well. So sometimes you'll get additional species than what you actually buy. It can spread vegetatively through turions, these little vegetative buds that occur in leaf axils, but also through tubers, which grow in the roots, and I believe it's estimated about 200 tubers per square meter in which one plant can produce. And so that's a lot of tubers. The distribution seems to be mostly in the southeast, but it's starting to occur into the upper Midwest. So it can also grow in very deep water where other plants cannot grow. So typically speaking, it can grow up to 20 feet below the surface, where most native plants usually remain around 8 feet. The kicker is that 80% of the biomass that it does produce is 1 to 2 feet from the surface, so essentially it shades out native species. Annually in Florida, it costs about $15 million to control, and then there's an annual loss of revenue through recreational value, agriculture, flood control, and residential property values. And so just a quick summary. So aquatic invasive plants are what we're really talking about. So they cause ecological or economic harm. They typically come in through outside their natural geographic ranges, and typically this is done through human activities resulting in intentional or unintentional release. And I think that's all I have for my presentation, so I guess questions or whatnot.
Okay, Greg. I think we have time for one question, and then we'll try to do a couple questions at the very end. We had one question dealing with whether or not hydrilla is also called the parrot feather.
No. Parrot feather is a different species. That's a Merophyllum aquaticum, and hydrilla is Hydrilla versalata. Though I believe parrot feather is of growing concern. So I have seen it for sale in a few retailers recently.
Okay, we'll save a couple of the other questions that you have gotten toward the end of the hour, if that's okay. What I'd like to do now is I would like to introduce our second speaker. Reuben Keller is an assistant professor within the Department of Environmental Science at Loyola University in Chicago. Dr. Keller studies the transport, establishment, and impacts of non-native species. Most of his current work deals with the development and use of risk assessment tools to identify invasive species that are being introduced through trade. Dr. Keller will be assessing the ecological risk of aquatic plants. Dr. Keller, you already have yourself unmuted, and I am going to give you the ball. All right.
Hi. Okay. Thanks for the introduction, Jill. So again, I'm Reuben Keller, and I'm at the end of my second year of a professorship at Loyola University, Chicago, and I'm going to be talking today about risk assessment for non-native aquatic plants. So what we've just heard from Greg is a really nice, clear description of the reasons that there are very many invasive aquatic plants out there that we don't really want in the Great Lakes ecosystems. So there are plants that we want to keep out. And the flip side of that is that there are a lot of plants that we don't mind coming in. There are a lot of plants in the aquarium trade and the water garden trade that pose very little risk of harm. And in fact, they're beneficial for us because they add value to the trades, and people like to buy them to have in their aquaria and to have in their water gardens. So the challenge for ecologists, and as Jill mentioned, this is something that I spend a lot of my intellectual capital on, the challenge for ecologists is trying to figure out the difference between those species that are likely to be harmful invaders and the species that are likely to be benign. And if we're going to do that usefully, then we need to do it before they arrive, because as Greg mentioned, the costs of eradicating aquatic invasive plants are enormous, and in fact, most of the time we just can't do it. Most of the time, by the time that we find an aquatic invasive plant that's established, it's too late to get rid of it. So there's real value then if we can try to predict what's going to be invasive before it arrives and try to keep it out. And this leads to this idea of what we call risk assessment. And this diagram here shows the invasion sequence. So as we run down this wedge, you can see that at the very top, there's what I refer to as the species pool. These are all of the aquatic non-native plants that are not in the Great Lakes. Some of them are blue. In fact, the larger portion are blue, and those are the benign species. And then there are some that are red. Those are the species that have the potential to go on to be invasive. Some of those are transported into the Great Lakes, often through trade, which is what we're talking about today, and we call those introduced. Some of those introduced species begin to reproduce, so they form self-sustaining populations. We call those species established. And then some of those established species spread and have some of those negative impacts that Greg's just been talking about. And those are the species that we call invasive. And you can see, obviously, that red wedge of species makes it all the way to the end. So the challenge for ecologists, and the challenge that I guess I've set myself, is trying to figure out what are those red species and trying to figure that out before they're transported here. So trying to look at that very top line of species and figure out what belongs to the red and what belongs to the blue. And if we can do that, and this is exactly the same diagram, of course, but this is annotated slightly differently so that it applies more closely to the trade in aquatic plants. So if we can look at the goal is to look at all those species that are available in trade or in various catalogs, and then we want to prevent those invaders, the red species, from being purchased and delivered into the Great Lakes region, because once they arrive, they can be planted, their population can grow, and then they can take over the landscape and become invasive. So risk assessment is looking at those species that are not yet here and trying to figure out which ones pose a large risk. Okay, so taking a step back, I've been working on this project over the last, actually about 8 years. We've been looking at trying to develop a risk assessment tool for aquatic plants in the Great Lakes. More recently, this has been done through a project funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative titled Preventing Invasions from Trade in Live Aquatic Organisms. We're not just looking at plants, we're also looking at fishes, mollusks, crustaceans, amphibians, and reptiles. So we're trying to develop risk assessment tools for all of these taxonomic groups. And you don't need to remember everyone who's working on it, but it's a large collaboration. We have people at Notre Dame, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, Sea Grant, and even Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. So all of us have been working on this project. And this began about 8 years ago when there were two fairly high-profile and high-impact invasions in Indiana. This is when I was a graduate student at Notre Dame, so I got involved with Doug Keller and Pat Charleboy. Doug Keller from the Indiana DNR, Pat Charleboy from Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. They were very concerned about these new invasions of Aegeria and Hydrilla, so they put together what came to be known as the Indiana Aquatic Plants in Trade Working Group. This had 25 members. We met every couple of months, and it included members from the industry, from universities, from NGOs, and from other places. So we first began working in 2007. We were meeting every couple of months. And one of the things that surprised me when I went into it was that we were all pretty much on the same page about this. I imagined when we got into this project that there'd be a lot of animosity between people like me who were saying we should be keeping plants out and people from the trades who obviously have a very strong economic incentive to keep plants in trade. But we were able to operate by consensus. Everyone agreed there are plants out there that we don't want in trade, and it's just a question of figuring out what they are and keeping them out. So that led us to begin putting together this risk assessment tool, and we decided to begin that with a tool that had already been developed in New Zealand, the New Zealand Aquatic Plants Risk Assessment Tool. And what we did over the period of years is modified and tested that tool to apply it to the Great Lakes region. So there's been a lot of work done on this. Krista Gantz, a technician at Notre Dame, has put in at least 2.5 years' work. The tool has been tested on almost 200 species. We've found that it works so well in the Great Lakes that we've also developed it for use in Florida and at the whole U.S. scale, the 48 states. Here in the Great Lakes, we've now tested all non-native established species, and this is already this is very gratifying for those of us who've been working on it. The Indiana Department of Natural Resources recently recently regulated an additional 28 species based on this work. It's strongly scientifically rigorous. There's been a huge amount of work go in, and that's what I want to describe now. So to give you a better idea of how we can try to accomplish this goal of discriminating between invasive and non-invasive plants. So the Aquatic Weed Risk Assessment, that's what the AQWRA means, Aquatic Weed Risk Assessment. To complete the weed risk assessment for any given species, you need to answer 38 questions. And there are 12 different categories, and those categories are listed here. So you've got to know something about its climatic tolerances and its distribution, whether it's been invasive elsewhere. And then you need to know quite a bit about its biology and ecology, because those are really the things that make a plant invasive or not, the way that it acts in the presence of elevated nutrients or low light, things like that. So I won't go through each of those categories, but you've got to answer 38 questions from these 12 categories. To do this for a plant species, depending on the species, it takes from about 4 to 20 hours for any given plant species. So you answer those 38 questions, and each question, the answer that you give corresponds to a score. When you get to the end, you sum those scores, you add them all together, and you come up with a total score for the plant, which ranges between 3 and 91. And then the challenge that we had, once we'd done this for a whole lot of plants, was to look at the data and then figure out what's the correct threshold to use, somewhere between 3 and 91. so that we can say if a plant scores above this threshold, it should be considered invasive. If it scores below, it should be considered non-invasive and safe for trade. So in order to do this, we had to look at all of the species that have become established in the Great Lakes in the past. We were using history as our guide to what's invasive and what's non-invasive. And we divided those up into three groups, and I'll give an example of the comparison between a major invader and a non-invader here, but we also had a group called a minor invader. So a major invader is something that's been in the Great Lakes, done a lot of damage. A minor invader is established but not harmful, and a non-invader is a species that was introduced but that failed to become established. So I'll just show some comparisons here for comparing a major invader, Eurasian water milfoil, with a non-invader, Japanese milfoil. So question 7.1, and again, this is just one of 38 questions, but it asks whether the species is capable of vegetative reproduction. You score it on a 0 to 5 scale, where 5 is basically yes, it can do great things with vegetative reproduction, down to 0, which is no vegetative spread. So you get this question, you've got the species that you're interested in, you go to the literature, various books, online sources, and for these two species, we discover that Eurasian water milfoil, Myriophyllum spicatum, is very good at growing vegetatively, while Myriophyllum aguirreiense is somewhere in the middle. It gets a score of 3. It can do some vegetative reproduction, but not a whole lot. Another question, question 12.1, which asks about the invasiveness of the species elsewhere. So, has it been invasive elsewhere? Again, you have we score it in this case from 0 to 5, and you can see the scale there where 5 is the most invasive. It's a harmful weed in many other countries, all the way down to 0, which is it's not established elsewhere at all. In this case, again, Eurasian water milfoil scores higher, getting 5 points. It's a very widespread aquatic invader, while the non-invader here gets 0 points. No evidence of naturalization outside of its native range. So that's examples of the types of questions that get answered. Again, there are 38 questions. So we've been through and done this for 83 non-native aquatic plant species that have been introduced to the Great Lakes. So again, we divided these up into 3 categories. And we're looking at history here. We're using history as our guide to what might happen in the future. So those 3 categories are major invaders, established species, documented ecological impacts. Minor invaders are established but no serious impacts. So that would typically be species that are established but that no one's out there trying to control. And then there are non-invaders, species that have been introduced but that have failed to become established. So from those 83 species, we had over 50 families, and we had a range of growth forms. So we tried to select these species to make sure that we were really testing across all of the biodiversity of species that can be introduced to the Great Lakes. And this is really the data part of what I'm presenting today. These are the results. So I'll start with the x-axis, which is the bottom horizontal axis, which runs from the 8 to 10 out to 71 to 86. So those are the scores of individual species. And if we then go to the y-axis, that's the frequency. So each one of these bars, for example, that very first green bar tells us that there were 4 species, that's the frequency, that got invasiveness scores between 11 and 14. And all of those species were non-invaders. If we go to the other end, we can see that there again were 4 minor invaders that got in the top range of scores, and it looks like 6 major invaders that got in the top range of scores. So that's what this graph shows. So the really cool result for us is that, as you can see, the non-invaders, the green bars, are generally grouped very much towards the left-hand end. The red bars, the major invaders, are generally grouped very much towards the right-hand end. They're scoring higher. And the yellow bars, the minor invaders, are generally grouped in the middle. Now, you'll also notice that this is not perfect. There are some green bars towards the right-hand end. There are some yellow bars out at the right-hand end. And there's quite a bit of overlap as well between non-invaders and minor invaders. So what we do is imperfect. We can come up with these predictions. We know we're not going to get them right all the time. But what this figure shows is that actually most of the time we do a pretty good job of discriminating between invaders and non-invaders. And in the context of what we're trying to do, which is explain what's going on in these very complex ecological systems, we think we're actually doing a pretty good job. So then you've got to go in and ask, what are the correct thresholds to use? So at what point do we draw a line and say, this is what history's told us. Based on that, we're going to draw a line and say anything in the future that scores above this threshold will be kept out. Anything that scores below will be allowed in. Now, if we treat non-invaders and minor invaders as the species that we're prepared to have come in, and major invaders as the species we want to keep out, then the threshold that we should go for is 57. And that would mean that we correctly assign 91.6% of all of those species. So that's if we decide that we're prepared to have those non-invaders and those established species that don't have impact. The other way that we can split these data is if we say, well, we don't want minor invaders either. They become established, and even though we don't currently know that they're invasive, we might be concerned about them becoming invasive in the future. If we group those together with non-invaders, then we have these four thresholds, 31, 32, 34, and 35, so basically all very close together. And if we use those thresholds, then we get an accuracy of 84.3%. So in each case, this tool works really well, actually. We can do a really good job of discriminating between invaders and non-invaders. And of course, at this stage, what I've shown you is just looking at history. But if we can do it so well, looking at what's happened in the past, there's really good reason to be confident that if we apply this risk assessment tool to species that could be introduced in the future, that we should expect it to do very well. Okay, so in conclusion, this tool, which is based on, it was developed for New Zealand, we've modified it for use in the Great Lakes, and it has very high accuracy here. So we believe that it can be used as a predictive tool for prioritizing which species should be allowed in, which species should not be allowed in, and also when we find new invaders, we believe it can be used as a tool to have a look at them. So before we know whether they're going to spread and have impacts, we can go and assess them, and this tool can give us, I think, some quite good information about how vigorously we should pursue control of those very new established species. As I mentioned, this tool has already been used to support new regulations in Indiana. We're working with every other state across the basin to try and help them to learn about the tool and to encourage them to see its value and hopefully to start using it. And we think that if we can get a coordinated response across the basin, so all or at least most states beginning to use the same sort of tool to decide what should be allowed in trade, then we can keep a lot of nasty invasive species that would otherwise arrive in the future. We believe that we can keep them out. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Ruben. We have gotten several questions, so let me get to a few of those. One question was dealing with, Ruben, your slide 13. This person wanted to know what were the non-invader and minor invader species that scored very high?
Yeah, I don't actually... should have that in front of me, but I don't. I could look that up, and actually I'll be able to look that up while Greg gives his second presentation, and I could enter that in the chat. What I remember when we looked at those species, they were species that had either not been in trade for very long, so it's possible that they just hadn't had much chance to become established yet. So they might not have truly belonged to that non-invader group, as in we might not have quite enough information yet about how they'll act. But it's also, and as I said, it's entirely plausible that this risk assessment tool works for most species. We've shown that it works for most species. We shouldn't expect it to work for all species because we're dealing with extremely complex dynamic systems, both in terms of the ecosystems being invaded and in many cases in terms of the actual species coming in. They arrive and they begin to evolve and they can change. So I will look and I'll try and figure out what those species are.
Okay, great, Ruben. Actually, there's another question, since you'll have that out, if you don't mind. Also, someone asked about the score of water lilies, specifically found in the inland lakes in Wisconsin. How did they score? So, if you wouldn't mind as well.
I will look that up.
Great. Another question that we had was, is it possible to develop a screening tool for all of the U.S. so that we can stop them from coming to the U.S. and be moved around in the states?
Yes, we have done it. We published it quite recently in a journal called Proceedings of the Public Library of Science 1, otherwise known as PLOS 1. I can send you that paper, Jill, and you might be able to post it with the rest of these documents when they go up.
Yes, that would.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. We've applied this tool at the scale of the U.S. And it does very well. The question becomes somewhat political then, because if they're going to be prohibited from coming in, then that means that the USDA, so the U.S. Department of Agriculture, would need to begin regulating plants a lot more proactively, in fact, a lot more actively, including proactively, than it has historically done. But there is a tool out there. If the USDA wants to use it, it's been developed and we've published on it.
Okay, great. One last question before we go on to Greg. If a plant is banned, how does that preclude someone from purchasing it by mail?
I'll jump in here. We have been able to work with a lot of plant suppliers who send things around by mail, and at least at some of those internet outlets now, they will not let you purchase plants that are banned for sale in specific states. So if you're in Wisconsin and you go to try to purchase species X, and species X has been banned in Wisconsin, then at least some of those internet providers now will have a little pop-up saying, "We're sorry, we can't sell that to you." That's by no means all of the providers. There are hundreds of them out there. So there's a lot more work to be done on that, but there is some progress being made. But that's certainly a case where it would be much, much better to have strong federal regulations prevent things coming in, because once they do get into the U.S., it's very difficult to stop interstate trade and transport.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ruben. I think just because of time here, we'll save the few other questions that we had gotten to the very end. Ruben, I am going to, if you're fine with that, mute you. And Greg, I am going to hand you the ball here.
Okay.
All right. Okay, you should have the ball.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about preventing the spread of aquatic invasive species next, specifically through water gardens. So this was a list of activities suggested by the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. I believe this list of activities is still being refined a little bit, so this may change, but I believe this is the most up-to-date list of ways of preventing the spread of aquatic invasive species from water gardens. So the guidelines are set up for all steps of owning a water garden. So this includes when you are thinking about constructing a new water garden, when you're adding plants, and when you're doing maintenance. And so this slide is just kind of showing the structure of what my talk is going to be like a little bit. So when you are constructing a new water garden, pretty much what we're saying is that people should choose a location away from natural waterways and flood-prone areas. And this is essentially to help ensure that plants and animals and water gardens will not be carried into local streams, ponds, lakes, or results of heavy rainfall. I had a great picture that I wasn't allowed to use, but I'm going to describe it anyhow. It was a mother and daughter in northern Texas fishing their koi out in the middle of the road from flooding. And so this is pretty much just thinking about trying to reduce the amount of introductions through potential flooding of water gardens. When you're adding plants to your water garden, we're suggesting that people purchase from licensed nurseries. Many jurisdictions require that a license be posted. If a license isn't clearly visible, ask an employee about their licensing. And each state is slightly different for how they license nurseries. So Illinois is different from Indiana, for example. Choose regionally native or non-weedy plants. So essentially this will reduce the amount of plant removal, so essentially the weeding of your water garden needed to maintain the garden. This is kind of going along the lines so that they go well in the environment in which you're putting them into, while also reducing the risk to nearby waterways should any plant be moved by wind, animal, flooding, etc. And so it's really reducing the number of introductions of potential new species for invasion. And so this is kind of based off of the risk assessment tool in which Ruben just talked about. And so this is a list of species that were potentially invasive. And so I should say this is a brochure that we're starting to develop this whole slide. So on the right side, this is a list of potentially invasive or known invasive species provided by that risk assessment tool. And then we worked with some individuals at the Chicago Botanic Garden to come up with a list of alternatives. So pretty much what we're going to do is create a brochure suggesting alternatives to potentially invasive species. And currently this brochure is being refined. So we hope to have this being distributed through organizations and retailers within the next few months here. And so the next step that we suggest people do is when you do buy those plants, rinse the plants in a bucket before planting. So essentially remove old dirt and any attached debris, including other vegetation, animals, or insect eggs before planting. And then go ahead and dump that bucket of water onto dry land and not into storm drains. Essentially, this will help to keep unwanted plants and animals from being accidentally introduced into your water garden and keep these same organisms out of the storm drains that might lead to natural waterways. So when you're doing your maintenance, check that your water garden remains isolated from natural waterways and areas that flood. So if it's been a while since you've installed your water garden, try to consider what
Greg, I think we lost your audio. Greg, are you still there? Greg, I may have you just call back in again, just because your audio has been lost. What we may do now, Ruben, if you're available, is possibly have you answer a few more of your questions. Hi.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Greg's going to come back on here in a second. If you wouldn't mind answering a few of the other questions that we had gotten during your presentation.
Sure, I can do that.
Great. We had another question. Someone had asked, given the devastating impacts of major invaders, can we afford to use a model with a near 10% margin of error? What are the precautionary principles that would prevent new introductions until the species are proven benign in their new locations?
Yeah, so that's really a policy question, and I'm really a scientist. So I can talk a little bit about the implications of that approach. As an ecologist, it's very, very hard to say that any species is completely benign. So if we were to take that approach, the approach that, I guess, guilty until proven innocent, then proving that something is innocent is very, very difficult. So what that would effectively mean is that the vast majority of non-native aquatic plants would be banned from trade. And if that's something that was acceptable from a management and policy point of view, then that would be fine, and we could forget about my risk assessment. The reason being that we'd be banning just about everything. We don't really need a complicated risk assessment tool to do that. What we hear from the state and federal managers that we work with is that this sort of error that we produce is acceptable as long as it keeps the trades running. So that's kind of the stimulus that keeps us going, preparing these risk assessment tools. But certainly, if it was a policy decision that we want to avoid all harmful invasive species in the future, and that was our number one overriding priority, then absolutely we should be keeping these species out and using the precautionary principle to say we just can't take this level of risk.
Okay, thanks, Ruben.
So sorry about that. So this is
great.
Greg.
Back.
Yeah,
okay.
Really sorry about that. I have no idea what happened to my phone line. So.
Okay. Do you want to continue on your presentation? And Ruben, we can just do a few more of your questions after Greg's presentation.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just about done anyhow, so this will be quick. So where was I? All right. So essentially what we're saying with this slide is that removing unintended plants that colonize your pond, so essentially weed your water garden. A plant that moves into your pond and becomes established is likely an invasive species. It should be removed and disposed of properly. So essentially just weed your water garden. Once you are disposing of your plant, we consider freezing unwanted plants in a sealed plastic bag and dispose of them in the trash. The reason why we're promoting this over composting is that because seeds and other reproductive plant parts may remain viable through the composting process. And then finally, what do you do with the animals that you have in your ponds if you no longer want them, like they're too big or they're sick? We pretty much suggest that contacting a pet retailer, animal shelter, or other water gardener to exchange those species. If your animal finds a home with another water gardener, make sure that it won't be released into the environment in the future. So it's just containing that species inside your water garden or a friend's water garden. If euthanasia is an option, we highly suggest that you consult a veterinarian before taking any action. And yeah, that was it. So.
Great. Let me see. Let me ask a few more questions that we had gotten. Another question, and this was during Ruben, your presentation. Would the use of screening tools by USDA save the U.S. lots of money in cleanup costs? And if so, have the scientists educating the congressional members about this or teamed up with those that will?
Yeah, so this one of the other things that I do is I work with economists to try and figure out exactly that question. If we start to pull species out of trade, then there are costs for trade, but there are benefits in terms of avoided harm, in terms of we avoid the harm from future invasive species. So I've been involved in a couple of efforts with economists to look at those questions. At least from work that's been published so far and from all the work that I've done, it's completely unambiguous. We should be using these risk assessment tools. It produces really quite small costs to trade, because it turns out that it's quite a small number of species that become invasive compared to the total number of species in trade. So it produces small costs for trade, huge benefits in terms of avoided impacts. And yes, I work quite closely with some people at the Fish and Wildlife Service and work up through their chain of command, trying to get to the policy nerve centers. And I've been out to DC a couple of times to talk to congressional staffers about this work. So yes, there is an effort going on to educate people about the risks from invasive species and the benefits from using risk assessment. To date, that has not had a huge impact, and we can all think what we like about the political process and the reason why that hasn't had a huge impact. But we're hopeful that over the next couple of years, we will see some much more enlightened policies coming out of DC.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ruben. I think those were all the questions that we had for Ruben. A couple other questions for Greg. Someone had asked, do any aquatic invasive plants cause harm to public health?
There's some links. I mostly found anecdotal links to that, such as water chestnut has sometimes been implicated in drowning deaths. Mosquito habitat is definitely associated with human health in some situations. And I guess flooding, when you think about flooding of, I guess, changing of flooding of wetlands, and like purple loosestrife, if you consider flooding a human health problem, when you have like sewage backing up and such, that could be a potentially a health problem. But those are the only examples I know, and I haven't really found any quantitative explanation of any of those. So.
Okay. And actually, I did have one more question for Ruben, and this might be also a question for Greg too. We had one person asking, they had said that they have been trying to control the spread of Phragmites grasses here in Door County, Wisconsin, and was very surprised when they were traveling the Lake District of England and discovered that they were trying to reestablish Phragmites in their lakes. The question that they had is, can we learn from the fact that their plants have not survived to find a way to control their growth here?
This is Ruben. I'm sorry, but I don't know the exact details in that case. But the short answer is, in many cases like that, yes, we can. We need to, once species become established here and we decided that we want to control them, then we need to know as much as we can about their ecology and their biology and any natural enemies they have in their native range, be those natural enemies fishes or birds or snails or viruses or something like that. So although I don't know the specifics of that case, Absolutely, yes. Once species become established here, if we're going to start spending money to control them, then it's obviously hugely beneficial to know as much as we can about those plants so that we can design the most effective controls.
Okay. Another question someone had was dealing with, are there any native alternatives to hydrilla?
Let me see. There's a few suggestions from the Chicago Botanic Garden. Let me see if I can look this up real quick, what they suggest specifically.
So this is Ruben. I'll jump in. The first thing is you probably don't want hydrilla in your water garden no matter what, because it will take over your water garden. If what you're looking for is a submerged plant that produces good amounts of oxygen for your fish, then there are plenty of alternatives that are native. But I'll defer to Greg, who I think has a better knowledge of the actual species that are available in trade at the moment.
Yeah, let's see. There's been suggestions of Alodia canadensis, Veloceriana americana, and Potamogean pictonatus. So these are American waterweed, wild celery, and sago pondweed. And these came from suggestions by Chicago Botanic Garden people and also the Department of Environment, formerly in Chicago.
Okay, great. We have one last question dealing with, people were asking whether or not they'll have access to that aquatic WRA list. So I just wanted to double check, Greg and Ruben, I know you were both going to supply some resources. If you could possibly send those to me and we could get the WRA list along with Ruben, I think that publication that you had mentioned, that would be great. The last thing that I wanted to find out was, Ruben, if you had an opportunity to look up those species that a couple of the attendees were asking about.
Yeah, I haven't been able to find the identities of those that are the non-invader and the minor invaders that ended up at the right-hand end, but I'll be able to look that up. We had two, so water lilies is kind of a funny group taxonomically. A lot of things are referred to as water lilies without being true water lilies, but we had at least two things that are commonly referred to as water lilies that we tested. And I might butcher the Latin names here, but Euryale ferox, which got a score of 19, and the other one was Nymphea candida, hardy water lily, which got a score of 17. So those were both generally down the lower end of the scores.
Okay, great, Ruben. One last question is, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get as many questions in as possible, if people don't mind. Regarding the risks of public health, have any exotic species of, and I'm going to not do a very good job, Apocyia, have been included in Ruben's analysis? This was in the Q&A in the bottom area. Apiaceae.
And that's the genus?
Oh, that's the family, Apiaceae, so it's the carrot family, I believe. So like, yeah.
Let me do some searching.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're actually out of time. So any of the follow-up questions that we have, we'll get out to everyone. I did want to again, thank the speakers for their willingness to talk with us today about the science behind invasive species. An excellent discussion. This webinar series was supported by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative through the US EPA. I also wanted to remind you that our survey URL for the webinar is in the chat feature. Please take a few minutes to fill that out. Thanks again to all the speakers and all the participants on this webinar. We hope this was beneficial, and feel free to join us as we continue this webinar series on Thursday with Building a Better Water Garden. Registration is still open and is in the chat feature. Thank you. Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Greg. Again, it was a great webinar. We really appreciate it, and everyone have a great afternoon.